Hello and welcome to this lecture on theory and research. After this lecture, students will be able to define concepts, variables, theory, hypotheses, and causality, distinguish between independent, dependent, extraneous, antecedent, and intervening variables, and explain conceptualization and operationalization. When starting a research process, we usually begin with asking a research question. Again, a scientific question, not a question about morals, values, or ethics. From that question, we then formulate a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an answer to our research question derived from our general theories and ideas about the world. Then we are going to collect data, analyze that data, and evaluate to see if our hypothesis about our research question is correct. Let's start with asking those research questions. Research questions are specific questions that can be answered by empirical research or research based on evidence that can be verified using observable data. Again, these questions are not moral, ethical, or theological questions. Rather, they are questions designed to be answered through collecting observable empirical data. Examples of research questions can include: how does educational attainment impact future income? Or what factors affect the promotion or hiring of female workers? Both these questions can be answered by getting and collecting empirical or observable data. After we have come up with a question, our next step is to generate or formulate a hypothesis. Hypotheses are generally drawn from the theories we hold about how the world works. A theory is a set of assumptions and propositions used to explain or predict and understand social phenomena. So how we go about understanding why something happens. A hypothesis is a testable prediction drawn from a theory that specifies a relationship between two or more variables that describe a unit of analysis. A unit of analysis is the subject or topic that we're going to analyze. A hypothesis needs to have two variables and a direction. So we have some examples here. People with higher levels of educational attainment will have higher incomes in the future, and people's educational attainment will affect their income. The first example here, people with higher levels of educational attainment will have higher incomes in the future, is a good hypothesis. We have two variables, levels of education and income, and we have a direction. As our level of education goes up, our income is going to go up. The second example here is not a good hypothesis because although it has two variables, again that educational attainment and income, it does not specify a direction. It just says that educational attainment is going to affect income, but doesn't specify that direction. So it cannot be a good hypothesis. So in general, hypotheses are going to have two variables and a direction. So we have some examples here. We have variables, study time and grades. The more you study, the higher your grades are going to be. The more hours you work, the less time you're going to have to sleep. And on top of this, we should always have a direction between the two variables. This direction can be positive or negative. So some examples of a positive relationship or a positive direction between two variables are: people who study more are likely to have better grades, or people who study less are likely to have worse grades. Here what we're seeing is that both variables, in this case study time and grades, are moving in the same direction. When one goes up, the other goes up. When one goes down, the other goes down. A negative relationship is when those variables move in opposite directions. So the example I have here are people who work more hours tend to sleep less. So as work hours goes up, sleep goes down. They're moving in opposite directions. That's going to be a negative relationship or a negative direction. So in a hypothesis, we're always going to have an independent and a dependent variable. A dependent variable or variables are variables that we are trying to explain. They're variables that we want to explain how they happen. the dependent variable is some sort of outcome. The independent variables are the variables that we think will do the explaining. So if we're thinking about a cause and effect, the independent variables are going to be the cause and the dependent variables are going to be the effect. The independent variables are what are going to cause some sort of change we see in the dependent variables. And so we're always looking for the independent variable to come first so that it can cause some sort of change to our dependent variable. And in general, part of this is we want to show causality. We want to show that the independent variable, again, is causing some sort of change to our dependent variable. In order to do that, we need to show that the independent variable comes first, then the dependent variable. It doesn't make sense to have an effect come before the cause, the same way it doesn't make sense to have the dependent variable come before the independent variable. Next, we need to show that there is some sort of relationship between these two variables, such that when one goes up, such that when the independent variable goes up, the dependent variable changes as well. So there has to be some sort of relationship or association there. Finally, we need to show that this relationship, such that the independent variable is causing some sort of change to the dependent variable, can't be explained by other factors or variables. These other factors or variables are often called extraneous or control variables. These extraneous variables create problems for causality and must therefore be controlled. The first here is mediating variables or intervening variables. Intervening variables are explained by the independent variable, but also explain the dependent variable. So they come in between, or they intervene in between our independent and dependent variables. Moderating variables, on the other hand, or antecedent variables, are variables that influence the relationship of both the independent and dependent variable. Antecedent variables therefore come before our independent and dependent variables. So again, intervening variables come between or intervene. Antecedent variables come before. And we can see that in kind of the root word for antecedent. For those of you who know Spanish, the word antes, before, is part of, related to this, the root word for antecedent, right, before. Examples here, education, here is going to be our intervening variable for the variables parental income and kids' income. So we're saying here that parental income is going to cause some sort of change to education, which is then going to cause some sort of change to the kids' future income. In our other example, hours worked might be an antecedent variable for study time and grades. So in this case, the amount of hours worked is going to affect how much you can study and then your grades. So in the intervening, it goes between parental income and kids' income. For the antecedent, it comes before study time and grades. So after we've come up with our variables, including our independent and dependent variable, as well as our extraneous variables, whether they be intervening or antecedent, we need to then conceptualize or go through a process of conceptualization in order to define those variables. So concepts are generalized properties or characteristics of our unit of analysis. Again, the unit of analysis is the subject of our study. It can be individuals, groups, states, countries, events, whatever, but it is the unit that we're going to be analyzing and measuring. And when we're doing this conceptualization, we need to define our concepts, our eventual variables, as narrowly as possible. The more narrowly and in detail that we can define our concepts, the easier it is going to be to go out and measure them. And this measurement is going to be our next step. We are going to what's called create operational definitions or go through the process of operationalization. This is the process of taking our concepts and making them into measurable variables or indicators. So when we go through this process of operationalization, we're going to create indicators which are then going to be measuring our variable. So indicators are measurable representations of a concept. Multiple indicators can be used to measure one concept or variable. Indicators provide a measure of a concept. A variable is composed of one or more indicators. Variables are measurable characteristics of our unit of analysis, and variables can be measured by multiple indicators. So we have some examples here. If our concept is intelligence, we might define that as, okay, we're going to measure intelligence by looking at your IQ score. So our variable is going to be IQ. Our indicator for that is IQ test score. If we came up with multiple aspects of intelligence, so that maybe an IQ test is not our only measure, those would be other indicators that we would use to measure this overall concept or variable of intelligence. Another concept is age. Pretty simple, but here even we need to define if our variable is going to be in years, months, or days. So an example would be our indicator as age in years that we get from someone's driver's license. Finally, the last concept is depression. So the variable here is depression, and we usually use a scale for depression, meaning we have multiple indicators that we add up to form an overall measure of depression. Depression is a very complex mental health issue, and just one question or one measurement is not going to accurately capture everything that goes into depression. So here we're going to have multiple indicators as individual survey questions asking about things like insomnia, feelings of depressions, feelings of suicide, trouble sleeping, right, sleeping too much, things like that. It should also be noted that variables are not specific values assigned to the unit of analysis. So a variable needs to be able to vary. So the variable may be years of age, but the values for that variable could be things like 18, 32, 47, 102, right? Those are values. Those are not variables. Variables are just years of age. Another example here is major. So like, what is your college major? The variable, again, is the major, and the values are things like math, engineering, or sociology. And the goal of all this is to be able to demonstrate that our independent variable is causing some sort of change to our dependent variable. And so we need to show that there's a relationship between the two variables such that a change in our independent is going to create some sort of change in our dependent, right? That our cause is actually causing the change we see in our outcome or effect. The independent variable therefore must come before or prior to our dependent variable. We then also have to rule out any other variables. We have to rule out any of those extraneous variables that might be causing changes to our independent or dependent variable. And we will occasionally come up with things that are called spurious relationships, where there's an association between our independent and dependent variables that is not causal. So an example might be that we see a relationship between our independent variable of ice cream sales and our dependent variable of shark attacks. Well, it doesn't seem all that likely that ice cream sales are causing shark attacks. There's probably an antecedent variable or an extraneous variable, such as the temperature, right, that is causing people to eat ice cream and also go swimming, right? So this sort of extraneous variable, like the temperature, is going to create a spurious relationship where it looks like there's a causal relationship between ice cream sales and shark attacks when there really isn't any sort of relationship. Non-spurious relationships are where there is an association between our independent and dependent variables and it is causal. For example, it makes sense that studying more is probably going to lead you to better grades. Alright, that's all for this lecture video. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.